Hello. So today I want to discuss an issue I feel is very, very, very important in Western, specifically Western politics. In fact, Western society, to be quite honest, it goes beyond just political structures, but to Western society as a whole. The reason I'm focusing on the West is A, I know more about the situation, more about the context, and B, I think it is perhaps more applicable in this part of the world. Um, I'm not sure what the situation is in countries like India or other democracies that are outside the Western Hemisphere, so I can't comment in great detail about that. I want to talk about the power of the media, and by the media, I want to specify what I'm referring to here because the media is a very, very large blanket term. I'm specifically referring to, in the case of the UK, the print press, and in the case of the United States, the news media networks. In both countries, it is absolutely irrefutable that the power of these networks, these newspapers, is vast, absolutely massive. Now, people think politicians are powerful, and certainly there is some power to be had with being an elected official. That goes without saying. You know, Barack Obama's a powerful man, David Cameron's a powerful man. That's true. There is definitely power there. Not least, you can make a decision on sending young men and women into war. And there's a lot of other factors that would definitely indicate that these are people whose decisions have enormous influence. But I am gradually coming to a conclusion that the most powerful people in our respective systems is not elected heads of state or elected leaders, but actually press barons. The Forbes magazine publishes a list of the world's most powerful people every year, and with one or two exceptions, all of those people are presidents and prime ministers. There's a few exceptions, business people, but generally speaking, they're presidents and prime ministers. There are some media tycoons in there, but generally speaking, they rank lower than the leaders. Now, the rationale behind ranking these people high, according to Forbes, is to what extent they influence a national economy. That's why they rank, for example, Angela Merkel very high because Germany's a big economy. But I have a few question marks about that as to why they automatically put the emphasis of power on politicians. Um, I really do think that when you look a bit deeper, you will see that I'll focus especially on the UK, but I could say a few things about the US as well from what I've observed as an outsider. Um, in fact, I'll speak briefly about the American situation simply because the American election is going on right now. The power of networks like CNN and Fox is vast. Now, CNN doesn't pretend that it's anything other than what it is. It is a very powerful news network. Fox News likes to say it's outside the establishment, it's not mainstream, but Fox News is basically the mouthpiece of America's right wing faction. There's no question about that. And I think it's pretty incredible for Fox News to try and claim that they're this brave underdog that stands up to the big guys. That's a lot of nonsense. Fox News is very powerful. Um, I know it's a bit more recent than CNN. I believe CNN was founded in the late 80s or the early 1990s, whereas Fox was 1996. Before that, actually, I need to do a bit more research into this, but before that, it would have been other networks that had the influence. But I think there's been a similar trend in the United States as the UK, where there has increasingly been power based on the media as a medium, and it has determined the outcome of presidential elections. To quote some notable examples, in 1988, it's often cited that Michael Dukakis lost the race because of that question about the convicted murderer and his attitude to crime. That media perception had a very negative fallout on the Dukakis campaign. Um, Looking further back in the 1960 race, an interesting phenomenon was that those who listened on the radio thought that Richard Nixon won the debate. Those who watched the television thought that JFK won the debate. And as it turned out, that was a very close election. JFK won, of course. Um, but JFK basically used that media format, which was incidentally the first televised presidential debate. But now it's unthinkable not to have televised debates in the American election cycle. It would be unthinkable. Um, but the power of a network like CNN or Fox is cannot be underestimated. It just can't be underestimated. How much they can either elevate or, on the other hand, demonize a respective candidate. Now, to be clear before I continue, I am not for a second saying that candidates don't have responsibility for their own image. I do believe that what a candidate says on the campaign trail matters, and I would never argue about shooting the messenger, i.e., criticizing a news network for simply reporting what a candidate has said. But every network has incredible bias, and there is no question about that. CNN has a blatant liberal bias, Fox has a blatant conservative bias, and no free thinking person, no rational minded person could try to argue otherwise because it's so blatantly obvious. Um, there are many who sarcastically nickname CNN the Clinton News Network, especially not just Republicans, and in fact, especially Bernie Sanders supporters. And I would more or less concur with that. I think CNN has been more or less peddling the Clinton campaign for a very long time. Only recently have they been starting to give a bit more balanced coverage to Bernie Sanders. And I'm not saying this as a Sanders supporter, I'm saying it from what I've observed. On the Republican side, I wouldn't say Fox is particularly biased to any individual candidate, but they're definitely biased towards the Republican Party, and they're definitely biased towards the right wing faction of the Republican Party. I know they have one or two token liberals. I guess you could say Juan Williams, and I forget the guy who's sometimes on with Sean Hannity. But the point I'm making here is that whatever your own political persuasions are, you cannot honestly look at any network and say it is genuinely neutral. It does not exist in the United States. Here in the UK, news media, I would say, has much less of an influence than the print press. So Sky News and the BBC, which are sort of respectively to the right and to the left, um, whilst they are influential, I would say in terms of political decisions, the print press is far more powerful, um, especially the tabloids. One of the most glaring examples is the Sun newspaper. Now, I'll be upfront about this. I'm not neutral on this. I hate the Sun, and I hate its influence. I believe it is a very, very negative influence, and I believe it basically corrupts our democracy. There are some important examples of whereby the Sun, which is Britain's largest circulated newspaper, I believe it has a circulation of 2.5 million, which is reduced, but that's generic to all the newspapers because they're going gradually online with new technology developing. Um, One example is the 1992 general election. They had a big headline and it said, "Will the last person to leave the country, um, if Neil Kinnock is elected, please turn off the lights." Neil Kinnock was the then Labour leader, and as it turned out, the Conservative Party had a very, very resounding win under John Major. The Sun backed the Conservative Party, they ridiculed Neil Kinnock, Labour lost the election. Now, it would be wrong to say that Labour lost because of that headline individually. I think there was a lot of genuine doubt about Labour in government, but I also believe that you cannot underestimate the power that that sort of headline has. More recently, they've been doing exactly the same thing with Ed Miliband. 2015, they had an ongoing and incredibly pathetic campaign to ridicule Mr. Miliband as much as possible, as someone had taken a rather unflattering photograph of him eating a sandwich. Now, when you actually bring it down to this, what it comes down to is the country's most powerful, or at least most circulated newspaper, dictating an election, trying to dictate an election on how a leader eats a sandwich. And when you think about that, not only is it pathetic, it is a glaring testament to just how, in my opinion, just how insidious the influence of the tabloid press is. So this was not a critique of a major policy area. This was not a critique of something that that newspaper believed would be damaging to the country. This was a character assassination based on ridiculing someone. Now, to be fair, the left wing equivalents do exactly the same to the Tory leaders. You know, they'll caricature them as old Etonians, and they'll caricature them as toffs. And if you have any doubt about the power of the press, consider this. In other parts of the world, you would have leaders who would have the power of suing such newspapers. In the United Kingdom, that would be unthinkable. I suppose technically a leader could try to, but they could not go ahead with that. It just wouldn't be taken seriously because they would be accused of being too sensitive. They would be accused of wanting to silence the press. And this is an area I really want to focus on. Now, in Western countries, we have come to this sort of understanding, and what I'm going to say might be quite controversial, but I'm going to say it anyway, just as an alternative viewpoint to put out there. We have come to this sort of notion that in order to have a transparent press, you have to have a press that has unlimited power. Now, a lot of people will complain about the press, but if you said you need to curtail some of their power, people would have a complete fit. And they say, wait a second, that's dictatorial. We're going to end up like China or North Korea. I take the view that what's actually happened in Western countries is the press, in the case of the UK, the print press, and in the case of the United States, the media, respective media networks have got so powerful that they are actually a dictatorship in their own right. They're actually authoritarian in their own right. Because as much as I don't want to admit it, I honestly believe that British general elections in recent years have been massively influenced by the hearsay or by the diktat of tabloid editors. Because if a politician decides to stand by their convictions, stand up for the views, and do what they feel is right, if that doesn't fit into the criteria or the political agenda of any given tabloid editor, that tabloid editor will go out of their way to utterly destroy that leader. Not on policy, but on character assassination. So I guarantee you, between 2020, between now and 2020, um, the tabloids are absolutely going to mercilessly, on unrestrained, absolutely mercilessly try and destroy Jeremy Corbyn's reputation. Not as a leader, not for his policy platforms, but as a person, as a man. They're going to ridicule him mercilessly. They're going to say he's a communist traitor. They're going to say all sorts of things. Now, this is the thing. I'm a centrist politically. I don't agree with all of Jeremy Corbyn's positions. In fact, I strongly disagree with some of his positions. But I believe that leaders need to be scrutinised on their policy and their policy alone. If there is any legitimate area to question their character, it should be on things like culpability to lead the country, to do the day runnings of the job. So if someone has serious health problems, that's a legitimate question. Because you don't want, someone who's in the position of prime minister to have a serious medical condition where they could suddenly die, if they've got terminal cancer or something. There are those sort of questions that are legitimate because it impacts the performance of the job. But when you get to a point where someone is being mercilessly destroyed, or at least there's powerful tabloid editors who are trying to destroy them solely on character and not on policies and not on how good a leader they would be, then it becomes very, very problematic in my opinion. Now, it would be wrong for me to say that tabloid editors have absolute power and they can do anything they like. That's not quite accurate. I would be very tempted to say that because they do have enormous power. It's not quite the case. Technically speaking, if they lie about someone, they have to legally print an apology. But it's still definitely not a level playing field. If a tabloid newspaper, or any newspaper for that matter, makes a front cover and they slander a public figure's name, or anyone's name for that matter, if they get it wrong, they're obliged to apologise, but the apology would be in small letters on page 30. I believe they should be legally required to make the apology in exactly the same font size as the original mistake. That's simple fairness. Simple fairness. There was a notorious case a few years ago where there was a young woman murdered in Bristol. Her landlord was one of the suspects being questioned. Now, before he had even been found guilty, one of the daily tabloid rags, I forget which one it was, had basically lambasted this man's image on the front cover. They didn't outright accuse him of the crime, but they basically assassinated his character. They said he was weird. They ridiculed his appearance. This was complete character assassination. As it transpired, he was innocent. It turned out to be a fellow lodger, a Dutchman, who was guilty of the crime. And this is a good example of just how poisonous the tabloid press can be. Now, in the end, I believe they paid the man some compensation, but that counts for nothing in terms of the character assassination they went through. And believe me, tabloid newspapers are absolutely loaded. I could just get into a rant here about all the things I hate about the tabloid press, and it would be very easy for me to do. Because goodness knows there's plenty of ground to criticise them on. I mean, their hypocrisy is one thing. They'll love to get on the moral perch and talk about, for example, the pay that politicians get. I've no problem with members of the public debating, but it's incredible that tabloid editors who are multimillionaires feel that they have some sort of moral high ground to question a regular MP on it's actually 72,000, which is a very comfortable amount of money. But the point I'm making is the wealthiest people in the country are not politicians. I don't know why people get so worked up about politicians' pay because the wealthiest people in the country are business magnates and media moguls. Sports people are well off, but media moguls are absolutely loaded. Um, and I would argue that they are nowhere near as what's the word I'm looking for, as accountable to the public as politicians are. Politicians, every 4 or 5 years, have to face the public. They have to, campaign, and wherever you think of that, that's what they have to do. And if the public doesn't like them, the public has a choice not to vote for them again. Um, Now, there are valid arguments that the public should have the power to get rid of MPs midterm if they really are doing a bad job. Okay, that can be an argument. But the point I would make is that there's no accountability really for tabloid editors. They can pay paparazzi to stalk people. They can pump out lies on a daily basis. They can pump out distortion on a daily basis and essentially get away with it. A small apology on page 30 really, really doesn't, it's not a level playing field. So they get away with it. And going back to the point I was making earlier, I think that it is very, very, we really do need to question the power that they have. In the United States, um, on one hand, I enjoy watching election coverage because I find it interesting. I just find the process interesting to see who's doing, who's the leading candidates and so on. But one aspect that does irritate me a bit is watching the smugness and the self-assured attitude of a lot of the political pundits. They sit there smugly thinking that they and they alone can determine the fate of a nation of 300 million people. They sit there and pontificate and judge, and to me, that's not journalism. That is pure egotism at work. Pure egotism. So, with Fox News especially, you see that sort of egotism coming through of the pundits. And I'm not saying you don't get it on CNN, you do. But to me, Fox is it's especially obvious in Fox. You know, when you get shock jocks and you get these people who pontificate, and they basically, there's an old rule in journalism: don't let yourself become the story. But on Fox News, pretty much every one of their anchors is driven by ego. And these people are on six figures. They're in a very, very privileged position. You know, the job of a journalist should be to scrutinize those in power. But when you get to a point where it goes well beyond scrutiny to the point of personal vendettas, which very often seems to be the case, you get interviews which are tough, and that's fine, but you get interviews that look blatantly like gotcha moments. Like the journalist or the interview in question is simply trying to humiliate the person they're interviewing. That's not journalism. That's not scrutiny. That's just a personal ego at play. I liked one bit in the last election, and I give him great credit for doing this. Ed Miliband was being grilled by Jeremy Paxman, who's one of our best known broadcasters. Paxman was being his usual self, pretty obnoxious and just being rude for the sake of it, basically. Ed Miliband at one point said, Jeremy, it's not you that decides, it's not me that decides, it's the British public that decide. I like that. And it backfired on Jeremy Paxman because what Miliband done there was turn it around and said, look, you guys can't call all the shots. And you know, I'm not totally denouncing Jeremy Paxman. I think in some areas, he is a good journalist. He's accomplished, but that aspect, I mean, Paxman personifies that sort of gotcha attitude that a lot of journalists nowadays have. And basically, we have embodied the other extreme, where the press and the media basically can. That I think the real power lies there. Now, in a country like China, the media has no power. The press has no power. There's no press freedom because it's entirely controlled by the ruling party. So that's the other extreme. And of course, I never ever want to see a situation like that. And I don't want to see a situation like Turkey where people are arrested for insulting the president. That's crazy. But I do feel that when you have a situation where the media is so powerful that a politician cannot simply focus on arguing for their policy, but they will constantly be threatened by character assassination if they push their policy, that it's just totally troubling, to be quite honest. And to me, it is a deep, deep threat to democracy. What I would argue is that the public need to reclaim democracy from press tycoons. In the case of the UK, Rupert Murdoch. And the solution is simple: don't buy tabloids. Because every time you buy a tabloid, you're making these press barons more powerful. I'm not telling people what to do, but that is the solution. I personally feel that tabloid editors should have to make a lot more public appearances. Because these guys, most of them aren't even household names. I know them because I've done my research. But, you know, if you said to the average Jill or Joe on the street, who is Paul Dacre or who is David Dinsmore, they wouldn't know. In fact, David Dinsmore has just been replaced at the Sun. You know, they wouldn't know. But if you said, who's David Cameron? Who's Jeremy Corbyn? Of course they're going to know. So they're basically like invisible assassins. They can hide behind their tabloid desk. You know, they can throw out all this damaging material. One of the most obnoxious is the Daily Mail. The reason I have contempt for the Daily Mail is because of the sheer arrogance of it. On their headlines, they basically play judge, jury, and executioner. And the thing about tabloid editors is they're like playground bullies. They can give, but they can't take. As soon as they are called out, then they immediately shout about press freedom and how they should be able to do whatever they want. When the whole phone hacking thing was going on, one of the debates was over who should regulate the press. Now, of course, journalists across the board were saying we should self regulate. I'm strongly opposed to that. The reason being, is because they simply cannot be trusted. The fundamental culture of Britain's tabloid press has proven it has not changed at all. Not at all. They got exposed to phone hacking and doing some very odious things, but the culture basically hasn't changed. They still employ paparazzi. They still distort very contentious issues. They still scapegoat and demonize people unable to defend themselves. And in my opinion, they're still not accountable. Now, you could say they're accountable from the point of view that people don't have to pay the newspapers, but politicians have to appear before committees. I believe politicians are under a lot more scrutiny than media barons. I really do. And basically, I view press tycoons as little better than gangsters. They're a little better than the Cray twins, basically making their demands, threatening people if they don't get their own way. They're gangsters in everything but name, as far as I'm concerned. And I am very, very biased in this because I hate the tabloid press. I hate them. I cannot express just how much I do hate them, but I do. And we have to get away from the thinking that if you talk about holding these people accountable, that's somehow an attack on press freedom. Look, press freedom is very important. It is very important that newspapers are independent of politicians. And you do need a medium in order to hold powerful people to account. I totally believe in that. Because the situation in China is terrible. Because there's no press freedom and the Communist Party can call all the shots. It's blatantly unfair. But it could be argued in Western countries the other extreme has transpired, where the media and the press have all the power. People think the politicians are powerful, but really, I don't think any government can get into power without having to basically pander to the tabloids to a large extent. And that's very sad. Shouldn't have to be that way. So we need a concerted effort across the board, especially from the public, to basically reclaim democracy from these press barons. They need to understand they cannot call all the shots. They're entitled to their opinions, just as we all are, but the power that they have is immense. So that's just a few of my thoughts. Thank you for watching.